The jewelry store shone under the soft light of the chandeliers, reflecting the brilliance of the perfectly arranged pieces in the display cases. The atmosphere was elegant, silent, and every detail exuded sophistication. Sarah moved with precision and affection, as she had always done for the past 15 years. Gently, she rearranged a display of diamond necklaces, checking each piece before closing the glass with the key she carried. Her watchful gaze passed over every detail, ensuring that everything was immaculate. Emily, seated at the farthest counter, drew concentrated on her homework notebook. With the tip of her tongue between her lips, she wrote the numbers of a long sum, frowning as she redid a calculation. Between one addition and another, she looked at her mother with a discreet smile. Sarah, even though busy, always found time to look at her daughter and encourage her with a nod or a smile. The jewelry store was almost like a second home for Emily, who spent her afternoons there while waiting for her mother to finish her shift. Margaret, the owner of the establishment, left her office and walked over to Sarah with a serene look. Dressed elegantly, she carried in her hands a set of sapphire earrings that she had just appraised. Her confidence in Sarah was unwavering, built over years of loyalty and dedication. "Sarah, my dear, could you please check the arrangement of the new collection? I want it to be perfect for the most demanding customers. No one has your eye for these things." Sarah smiled with pride, taking the earrings gently. "Of course, Margaret. I'll make sure they're well positioned. I know how special this collection is to you." Margaret nodded, observing with admiration the employee who had become almost a confidant over the years. On the other side of the store, Thomas remained silent. The manager watched everything with a watchful and calculating gaze, leaning against the counter while pretending to review some notes. His eyes passed over Sarah and then Margaret, analyzing every movement. His face revealed no emotion, but there was something about him, a tension disguised behind the neutral expression. Sarah approached the main display case and began to organize the new collection. Her hands worked delicately, adjusting the earrings and necklaces symmetrically. Her gaze was careful, as it had always been. Everything had to be in the right place. Emily, watching her mother from afar, smiled and turned her attention back to her lesson. She felt safe there, in that space where Sarah was respected and valued. Margaret stopped beside Thomas, watching Sarah with a satisfied smile. "If all my employees were like her, I would never have any worries," she commented, crossing her arms. Thomas nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the scene. "Indeed, she is very dedicated, almost perfect." There was something strange in his voice, an intonation that Margaret did not notice. The woman just laughed lightly, shaking her head. "I wouldn't say almost. Sarah is an example of professionalism, honest, punctual, attentive. I trust her with my eyes closed." Oblivious to the conversation, Sarah finished adjusting the last details in the display case, making sure each piece was in the correct place. The reflection in the glass revealed Thomas's gaze fixed on her, watching every movement, with an interest that could not be justified by work alone. The tranquil routine of the jewelry store was abruptly interrupted when Margaret, while reviewing inventory at the end of the afternoon, noticed something strange. With the inventory sheet in hand, she went through the display cases and internal safes, recounting with an increasingly worried look. Her eyebrows furrowed when she noticed the discrepancy. Some valuable pieces from the newly exhibited collection were simply not where they were supposed to be. "This cannot be right," she muttered, quickly flipping through the pages of the inventory, trying to find an error that would justify that absence. Tension filled the atmosphere as Margaret proceeded to check other compartments. Thomas, attentive to every reaction from his boss, approached with a concerned expression. "Did something happen?" he asked, leaning slightly to observe the list Margaret held firmly. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the restlessness in her voice was evident. "Some pieces have gone missing. I personally reviewed everything this morning, and now jewelry from the new collection is missing." The news spread quickly among the employees who were still in the store, generating a murmur of apprehension. Sarah, overhearing the commotion, approached Margaret with a worried look. "Are you sure there wasn't a counting error?" "I can help look," she suggested, keeping her tone serene, although she felt a tightness in her chest due to her boss's visible disquiet. Margaret rubbed her temples, trying to concentrate. "I checked twice, Sarah. It's not an error. Someone took those jewels and they need to show up now." The heavy silence that took over the environment was interrupted by Thomas, who cleared his throat before suggesting with a controlled voice, "Perhaps we should check the employees' lockers. I don't want to accuse anyone, but if there was a misunderstanding, the best way to clarify is to ensure nothing was stored in the wrong place." Sarah frowned, feeling a growing discomfort within her. That doesn't make sense, Thomas. No one would take something without authorization. We've worked together for years. I'm sure we'll find those pieces without having to go that far. Margaret, however, was already moved by the urgency of the situation. We can't rule out any possibility, she said, walking determinedly towards the locker area. Thomas followed her closely, casting a discreet glance at Sarah before opening one of the compartments. The seconds that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. With a calculated motion, Thomas opened Sarah's locker and, after a few moments of searching, pulled out a small black velvet case. Margaret's eyes widened when he opened it, revealing some of the missing pieces inside. "My God, it can't be," she exclaimed, bringing her hand to her chest as shock took over her face. Sarah took a step forward, feeling the blood drain from her face. "This can't be in there. I would never put anything in my locker." Her voice trembled, but not with guilt. It was disbelief, despair at the trap forming around her. Thomas closed his expression, feigning an uncomfortable seriousness. "Sarah, I really hoped it wouldn't be you. You've always had everyone's trust here. How did this happen?" Margaret blinked repeatedly, trying to assimilate what she saw. "I trusted you for 15 years, Sarah. I always said you were like family to me." Her voice broke at the end of the sentence, laden with anguish and disappointment. Sarah shook her head, feeling despair take over. "Margaret, please, you know me. I would never do this. Someone put those jewels in there." Thomas crossed his arms, letting out a heavy sigh. "I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence is here. We need to call the police." The ground seemed to disappear from under Sarah's feet when she heard those words. Emily, who had been watching the scene from afar without fully understanding what was happening, dropped her pencil and notebook, getting up in a hurry. "Mom, what's going on?" Her childish voice cut through the silence of the jewelry store, laden with worry and fear. Margaret hesitated for a moment, but the mistrust and weight of the betrayal seemed to cloud her judgment. With a faltering motion, she picked up the phone and dialed the police. Sarah took a step forward, her heart racing. "Margaret, don't do this. I'm innocent." But the woman's gaze, full of sadness and anger, said it all. When the police officers arrived minutes later, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The customers who were still in the store looked on with curiosity, and murmurs spread throughout the place. Sarah stood motionless as the officers approached, still unable to believe that this was really happening. "Miss Sarah, please turn around and put your hands where we can see them." Sarah's breathing became ragged. "This is a mistake. I didn't do anything." Her voice came out louder, but the police officers didn't hesitate. One of them firmly gripped her arm, while the other drew out the handcuffs. Emily ran towards her mother, her face already covered in tears. "Don't take my mum, she didn't do anything." The little girl tried to pull on the officer's sleeve, but her tiny hands were useless against the cold authority of the moment. Sarah felt the cold metal of the handcuffs on her wrists and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to maintain her composure. "Emily, my love, it's going to be okay. I'll sort this out, I promise." But the girl sobbed, unable to understand how something like this could be happening. Margaret watched it all in silence, her eyes brimming with tears, but without saying a word. It was as if a part of her didn't want to believe, but the evidence before her spoke louder. Thomas, for his part, kept a stern expression, but there was a discreet gleam in his eyes, like someone who saw a plan unfolding exactly as expected. As Sarah was escorted out of the jewelry store, her steps were heavy, dragging, as if she were being led to a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The last thing she saw before crossing the doors was Emily, in the arms of an employee, crying inconsolably. The sound of her daughter's voice echoed in her mind, and the weight of injustice settled upon her shoulders like a cruel sentence. Emily remained motionless in the middle of the jewelry store, her eyes wide and red from crying so much. Her little hands trembled as she tried uselessly to reach her mother, but the police officers were already dragging her out the door. "Mommy!" she cried, her voice choked, unable to accept the scene unfolding before her. The people around watched in silence, some murmuring among themselves, others just averting their gaze, embarrassed by the brutality of the situation. Julie rushed in, her face pale as she saw the scene. Her heart tightened when she found Emily there, so defenseless, so lost. Without hesitation, she ran to the girl and hugged her tightly, enveloping her in a protective embrace. "Everything will be all right, my love. I'm here with you," she murmured, trying to contain her own emotion. But Emily couldn't stop sobbing, her little body shaking in her mother's friend's embrace. "They took my mom, Julie. They put those handcuffs on her like she was a criminal. But she didn't do anything. She would never do anything wrong." Julie swallowed hard, feeling a lump forming in her throat. She had known Sarah for years and knew this was a mistake, a terrible injustice. "We'll sort this out, Emily. We'll prove your mom is innocent. You trust me, don't you?" Emily nodded with difficulty, though despair was still etched on her little face. On the other side of the store, Thomas remained slightly apart, watching the scene with a calculated expression. His posture was that of a man devastated by the situation, his gaze laden with false consternation as he slowly shook his head. "This is a tragedy. I never imagined Sarah was capable of something like this," he murmured, loud enough for some people around to hear. His voice sounded convincing, almost remorseful, but his hands, discreetly occupied, betrayed his calculated tranquility. With controlled movements, he opened his leather briefcase on the counter and slid a thick envelope inside. The white edge was visible for an instant before he closed the briefcase and pulled it closer to himself. No gaze fell upon him. No one noticed his gesture, for everyone was still shocked by the scene that had just unfolded. Julie cast a brief glance in Thomas's direction, discomfort growing within her. Something seemed wrong, very wrong. But at that moment, her priority was Emily. Kneeling to be at the girl's height, she gently wiped away the tears running down her face. "Let's go home, Emily. You don't need to be here seeing this. We'll think about how to help your mother, but now you need to rest." Emily held Julie's hand tightly, trying to find some security amidst the chaos. "I just want my mom back," she whispered, a thread of fragile hope in her voice. The night fell heavy and silent, but inside Julie's small apartment, Emily found no peace. Curled up on the bed Julie had improvised for her, the girl stared blankly at the ceiling, her small hands clutching the pillow tightly. The void left by her mother's absence was an immense hole within her, an unbearable weight that tightened her chest and wouldn't let her breathe properly. "She's coming back, isn't she?" she asked, her voice weak, almost a whisper, breaking the silence of the room. Julie, sitting on the edge of the mattress, ran her hand through the girl's hair, trying to provide comfort, but she herself didn't know how to answer that question. "We'll do everything we can to bring your mother back. I promise I won't rest until we prove she's innocent." But Emily didn't seem convinced. Her eyes remained watery, her small body trembling with cold and fear. "I can't sleep without her. She always gives me a goodnight kiss and sings a soft song until I close my eyes. How will I sleep now?" Julie felt a tightness in her chest upon hearing those words. She held the girl tighter, trying to give her some kind of security. "I know nothing I do will replace your mother, Emily, but I'm here with you. If you want, I can sing to you. I can hold your hand until you fall asleep." But Emily just closed her eyes and shook her head. "It's not the same thing," she whispered. A few kilometers away, Sarah sat in the cold prison cell, her arms crossed around her own body. Her eyes still had traces of dried tears, and her mind spun in a whirlwind of thoughts that made no sense. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She hadn't done anything. Then how could she be there? The strong smell of disinfectant mixed with mold permeated the air, and the thin mattress on which she was sitting was as hard as the floor. Her gaze wandered through the bars, as if at any moment she would wake up from this nightmare. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she refused to give in to despair. Her thought was on Emily. Had her daughter been able to sleep? Was she safe? Every minute away from her was torture, a suffering that burned inside her chest. "I have to get out of here," she muttered to herself, her voice weak but full of determination. "Emily needs me." Meanwhile, outside, the scandal was beginning to spread. Margaret stood in front of the jewelry store, giving an interview to a local reporter. Her face was weary, haggard, and her voice carried a mixture of sadness and disbelief. "Sarah worked with me for 15 years. She was like a daughter to me. I never imagined she'd be capable of something like this." The reporter leaned in slightly, microphone in hand. "Do you feel betrayed by someone you trusted?" Margaret sighed, averting her gaze for a moment before facing the camera again. "I feel like I made a mistake in placing so much trust in someone. We all think we know people, but in the end, we never really know what they're capable of." The words were like knives cutting through the last shreds of hope that remained for Sarah. The following days were a test of endurance for Julie and Emily. Julie's apartment, once an organized and peaceful space, now felt small and chaotic, with a scared little girl trying to adjust to her mother's absence. Julie did her best to create a routine that would bring some normalcy for Emily, preparing breakfast, packing her backpack for school, and trying to distract her with conversation. But no matter how hard she tried, Emily remained withdrawn, her gaze always distant, her lips pressed tightly as if she were holding back tears all the time. "Do you want pancakes today?" Julie asked, trying to sound cheerful as she flipped the hot batter in the pan. Emily, sitting at the table, played with her spoon with no real interest in the food. Mum used to make pancakes on Saturdays. Today isn't Saturday, she mumbled, not taking her eyes off the empty plate. Julie sighed, sitting down next to the girl and taking her small hand. I know nothing I do will be the same, Emily. But I'm trying, and I just want you to know you're not alone. Emily finally looked at Julie, her big sad eyes, and nodded slightly. I know, thank you. But the sadness was still there, weighing heavily on her fragile shoulders. Outside, Julie's neighbors started whispering. The news of Sarah's arrest had spread quickly, and some people threw curious glances when Emily left home for school. Julie noticed the whispers and discreet exchanges of glances between the building and street residents. Poor girl, she heard one woman murmur to another as they passed her in the hallway. And to think the mother was a thief all this time? Julie clenched her fists, feeling anger growing inside her. She couldn't stand hearing those insinuations. Sarah didn't steal anything, she said, in a firm enough tone for the two women to stop whispering. But the doubtful looks continued, and Emily lowered her head, ashamed. Julie wrapped her arm around the girl's shoulders and guided her out without saying anything else, but her heart burned with indignation. Meanwhile, at the jewelry store, Thomas took complete control. Margaret's office, once a space where Sarah was welcome to discuss important matters, was now restricted to him alone. Sitting comfortably in front of the computer, he reviewed financial reports while a discreet smile formed on his lips. Finally, he murmured to himself, swiveling the chair and crossing his arms, satisfied with the new position. With Sarah out of the way, there were no more obstacles to his plan. However, his tranquility was interrupted when Margaret entered the office, her eyes tired and her posture rigid. I don't know how all this happened, she said, rubbing her forehead with her fingertips. Sarah was like a daughter to me. Thomas sighed and leaned back slightly in the chair. I know it's hard, Margaret, but we have to move on. The store needs leadership now, and you need someone who ensures nothing like this happens again. Margaret nodded slowly, unaware of the hidden satisfaction in Thomas's gaze. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Sarah sat in front of a cold metal table on the other side of thick glass, anxiously awaiting the arrival of her public defender. Her heart was racing, her hands were ice cold. Since being arrested, she hadn't had any chance to properly defend herself, and now finally she would have a lawyer to help her. But when the door opened and a middle-aged man with a tired look and a battered briefcase entered and sat down, Sarah felt a weight on her chest. Mrs. Carter, I'm your public defender, he said, not even looking at her properly as he opened the folder full of papers. I'll be representing you in court. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the despair growing. Great. So can you help me prove that I'm innocent? I never stole anything. Someone set me up. I need you to investigate, to get evidence, to talk to the people who know me. The lawyer sighed, adjusting his glasses and scanning the sheets in front of him. I understand, Mrs. Carter, but I must be honest with you. Cases like this are difficult. The evidence against you is solid. The judge may accept a deal, reduce your sentence if you cooperate. Sarah's heart raced. I'm not going to accept any deal. I'm not guilty. Her voice rose involuntarily, laden with indignation and fear. The lawyer closed the folder with a sigh. Let's see what we can do. But Sarah felt deep down that he didn't believe her, and that made her fear for her future more than ever. The sun had not yet fully risen when Julie left home with Emily to take her to school. The city was slowly waking up, with cars lazily passing through the streets and some stores opening their doors. Emily clutched her backpack tightly, walking beside Julie without saying a word. Since Sarah's arrest, the girl had become even more silent, her expression laden with constant sadness. Julie tried to distract her with small conversations, but nothing seemed to have any effect. While waiting for the traffic light to cross the street, Julie noticed a small, discreet cafe on the corner, away from the usual route she would take. Her eyes caught a peculiar scene through the glass window. Thomas was sitting alone at a secluded table, nervously looking around. His foot tapped restlessly on the floor, and his hands gripped a thick white envelope. Julie frowned, feeling a shiver of suspicion run down her spine. Emily, just give me a second, she said, stopping on the sidewalk while pretending to search for something in her purse. With a quick glance, she observed Thomas lift his head as a tall, burly man approached his table. The stranger leaned slightly over him, his eyes fixed on the envelope Thomas was clutching so tightly. Thomas's demeanor changed completely. His face grew paler, and he lowered his head as if trying to avoid the other man's gaze. After a brief moment of hesitation, he pushed the envelope forward on the table with trembling hands. The man calmly took the envelope, opened a slit to check the contents, and satisfied, slowly nodded. Julie felt her stomach churn. Something was very wrong. Thomas, who had pretended to be devastated by Sarah's arrest, now seemed terrified in front of that man. The way he handed over that envelope, as if it were an obligation, indicated that something deeper was happening. Julie? Emily's voice broke her concentration. The girl looked at her curiously, not understanding why they had stopped. Julie blinked a few times, trying to regain a neutral expression. "Nothing, dear. Let's go." But as they crossed the street, her heart raced. Something told her this wasn't the first time Thomas had met that man. And if her suspicions were correct, perhaps that envelope contained the answers they needed to prove Sarah's innocence. The suspicion growing inside Julie since the day she saw Thomas at the cafe wouldn't leave her alone. No matter how hard she tried to push the idea away, something inside her screamed that something was wrong with that situation. The way he trembled as he handed over the envelope, the submissive posture in front of that intimidating man, nothing made sense. Thomas had never seemed like the kind of person who would let himself be pressured. So why did he now seem so vulnerable? Determined to find answers, Julie made a decision. She would start observing Thomas more closely. She waited until the end of the jewelry store's business hours and, unnoticed, remained inside the parked car across the street, keeping an eye on the main exit. The clock struck closing time when Thomas finally appeared. He rushed out of the building, adjusting his tie and casting discreet glances around. Julie narrowed her eyes, her instinct confirming there was something suspicious about those movements. Maintaining a safe distance, she followed him through the bustling streets until she saw him enter the same cafe where she had seen him deliver the envelope days before. She parked across the street, watching him intently. As before, he chose a secluded table, sat down and began fidgeting restlessly with his phone. A few minutes later, a waiter brought a coffee that he barely touched. The pattern was forming. Same place, same time, the same evident nervousness. Julie took out her phone and discreetly snapped a few photos through the car window. If something was happening, she would need evidence, but it still wasn't enough. She needed to know who he was meeting, what was being discussed at these meetings, and above all, if this had any connection to the unjust accusation against Sarah. As Julie began her silent investigation, Emily, on the other hand, was starting to notice changes inside the jewelry store. Since Sarah had been arrested, the girl no longer wanted to enter that place, but she had to stop by after school, accompanied by Julie, who pretended to be just picking up a document for Sarah. Emily stayed close to the entrance, observing everything with watchful eyes. The store no longer seemed the same. The employees, once always smiling and attentive, now seemed tense. The atmosphere was heavy with a strange mood, and even Margaret seemed more distant, as if she carried an invisible weight on her shoulders. But what caught Emily's attention the most was Thomas. Now that he was in charge, he moved with an exaggerated authority, giving curt orders and checking everything with a distrustful look. But it wasn't just that. Emily noticed that some display cases were emptier than before. Pieces that were previously on display were now being stored away faster than usual. Something wasn't right. The girl discreetly tugged at Julie's sleeve when she came back near her. "There's something wrong here," she whispered, her eyes fixed on Thomas. Julie followed the girl's gaze and realized she was right. Thomas's behavior was different, very different, and that only reinforced the certainty that they were on the right track. Julie felt she was getting closer and closer to the truth. Thomas's behavior, his constant restlessness, and the changes in the jewelry store made it clear that something was amiss. But to prove that Sarah was innocent, she needed something concrete, something that could be presented as evidence. So that night, she decided to follow Thomas again. She parked her car at a safe distance from the cafe where he usually met up. She adjusted her phone, making sure the camera was activated, ready to record anything suspicious. Time passed slowly, and she tried to remain calm, but her heart raced every time she thought of the possibility of finally discovering what was going on. When Thomas arrived, his hands were stuffed in his coat pockets, and his eyes scanned the street before he entered. Julie shrank a little further into the car seat, watching intently. He sat at the same secluded table as always, and it wasn't long before the intimidating man Julie had seen before approached him. She gripped her phone firmly and began recording. Thomas placed a brown envelope on the table and slid it towards the man, who picked it up without saying a word. With steady hands, he opened the envelope and quickly counted the bills inside. "This is not enough," the man said, his voice low but laden with threat. Thomas wiped his brow, looking even more nervous. "I need more time. I've gotten a part of it. I'm trying to sell some pieces without raising suspicions." Julie felt her heart race. Sell some pieces? She frowned, gripping her phone even tighter. The man leaned forward, his face now just a few inches from Thomas's. "Time is running out. You think you can fool people like me? If you don't pay what you owe, the consequences will be worse than losing control of a jewelry store." Thomas swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll get it. Just give me a few more days." Julie knew she had captured something important. The man was clearly a debt collector, and Thomas was desperate to get money. If he was trying to sell pieces without raising suspicions, it meant he could be stealing from his own jewelry store to pay his debt. And that meant Sarah had been framed to cover up his own crimes. As Julie gathered evidence, Emily faced a different challenge. The school, which had once been a place where she felt safe, now seemed a cold and distant environment. Her teachers looked at her with pity, and some children whispered as she passed by. During recess, Emily sat alone on the bench in the yard, holding her lunch without any desire to eat. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, her body hunched over. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want to play. She just wanted her mother back. The teacher watched from afar, concerned about the drastic change in the girl. She decided to call Julie, who soon appeared at the school to pick up Emily. In the car as she drove home, Julie looked at the girl through the rearview mirror. "Do you want to talk, dear?" she asked in a gentle tone. Emily shook her head, her eyes full of tears. "I just want my mum." Julie gripped the steering wheel tighter. She needed to prove the truth, not just for Sarah but for Emily. Julie knew she was getting closer and closer to the truth. The images of Thomas handing money over to the debt collector were already strong, but they weren't enough to exonerate Sarah. She needed something more explicit, something that would leave no doubt about his guilt. That's why the following night she went back to following Thomas. This time she kept a greater distance, walking discreetly on the opposite sidewalk from the cafe, pretending to be distracted on her phone. Thomas left the establishment with hurried steps, holding the phone against his ear while speaking in a tense tone. Julie quickly activated the audio recording on her phone and hid behind a parked car, trying to catch every word. "I already told you I'm taking care of it," Thomas said, his voice laden with frustration. "I need more time, but this debt will be settled soon. I've gotten rid of one problem. I don't need another one." Julie held her breath, feeling her stomach churn. Thomas's voice continued, low but full of nervousness. "Yes, the store is still under control. Without Sarah here, no one suspects anything. Just a little longer and I'll get what I need." Her heart raced. That was a confession. Not the definitive one, but enough to show that Thomas had something to hide. She clutched her phone against her chest, feeling a glimmer of hope ignite. Now she needed to find a way to use that in Sarah's favor. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Emily was finally able to visit her mother in prison. The girl held Julie's hand tightly as they crossed the cold, artificially lit corridors. Each step seemed heavier than the previous one, and when she finally saw Sarah sitting on the other side of the glass, Emily couldn't hold back her tears. "My princess," Sarah murmured, picking up the phone in the booth with trembling hands. Emily grabbed the other phone and pressed her face against the glass, sobbing, "Mommy, I miss you so much. I don't want you to stay here." Sarah's eyes were also teary, but she tried to stay strong. "I know, my love, but I promise this will end. I'm innocent and we'll prove it." Julie, next to Emily, took a deep breath and looked at Sarah with determination. "I'm gathering evidence, Sarah. I saw Thomas meeting with a debt collector. He's selling the store's jewelry to pay what he owes. I recorded a conversation where he admits he got rid of a problem. That means he set you up." Sarah blinked rapidly, trying to assimilate everything. "Can that help me?" she asked, hope growing in her voice. Julie nodded. "It's a start. And I won't stop until I prove your innocence." Emily wiped away her tears and pursed her lips, determined. "I'll help too. I know you didn't do anything wrong, Mom, and I won't let anyone say otherwise." Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. For the first time since her arrest, she didn't feel alone. Julie knew she needed to act more strategically if she wanted to expose Thomas. So far, all her evidence was too flimsy to convince a judge. The audio recording was useful but not definitive. She needed something more concrete, something that would irrefutably show Thomas was behind everything. That's why that morning, after dropping Emily off at school, she drove to an electronics store and bought a high-resolution camera with a powerful zoom and an advanced audio recording app. She spent hours watching tutorials and testing the equipment, learning to set it up in the best way to capture clear conversations even from a distance. Every detail was essential. She couldn't make any mistakes now that she was so close to uncovering the truth. Seated at the kitchen table, she tested the camera's range by pointing it towards the neighboring apartment's window and adjusting the microphone levels until she could capture even the subtle street noises. "Now I'm ready," she muttered to herself, determined. Meanwhile, at the jewelry store, Margaret started noticing small changes. Since Thomas had taken over, the environment seemed different, not just because of the tense atmosphere among the employees, but due to his increasingly strange behavior. One afternoon, while reviewing the inventory, she caught Thomas leaving the store's vault with a discreet box in his hands. He tried to act normally, but his rigid posture and the way he avoided her gaze made Margaret's chest tighten. "Thomas, what's that?" she asked, crossing her arms and eyeing him suspiciously. He blinked a few times, as if he hadn't expected to be questioned. He forced a quick smile and held the box more firmly. "There's some pieces that need maintenance. Nothing major, just a routine that Sarah used to do," he replied, keeping his voice controlled. Margaret frowned. Something didn't seem right. For 15 years, Sarah had been absolutely transparent with her about any pieces leaving the store. Now suddenly, Thomas decided to do this without even telling her. The feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. "I want to see the outgoing report for those pieces," Margaret said, trying to keep a firm tone. Thomas hesitated for an instant before forcing another smile. "Of course, Margaret. I'll leave everything on your desk later," he replied, hurrying to leave. Margaret remained still for a few seconds, watching him disappear down the hallway. Her instincts told her there was something strange about that story. For the first time, a small doubt began to form within her. Had she been too hasty in trusting Thomas so much? Julie knew her investigation was becoming dangerous, but she couldn't back down now. After learning to use the new camera and audio recording app, she started following Thomas more frequently. Every move he made was calculated, every suspicious encounter recorded. However, her insistence began to draw attention. That night, as usual, she parked across the street from the cafe where Thomas held his secret meetings. With the camera adjusted, she began filming as he fiddled with his phone, visibly tense. But something was different. Thomas looked around more often, checking his surroundings, as if sensing he was being watched. Julie felt a chill down her spine when his gaze briefly crossed hers, even from a distance. For an instant, she felt he had noticed her presence. She tried to disguise herself, lowering her head and pretending to fiddle with her cell phone. But when she raised her eyes again, Thomas was no longer sitting at the table. Her heart raced. He had vanished. Panic seized her when she heard footsteps rapidly approaching the side of the car. With quick reflexes, she turned off the camera, grabbed a cold coffee from the holder, and pretended to be merely drinking. The car door next to her opened forcefully, and she heard Thomas's voice speaking to someone. "Someone's following me. I don't know who it is yet, but if it's a problem, I'll take care of it myself." Julie gripped the cup so tightly that her fingers began to ache. Her disguise seemed to have worked, but now she knew Thomas was on alert. If he found out it was her who was after him, the consequences could be dangerous. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Emily was returning home from school. Her mind was still filled with confused thoughts about her mother, about everything that had happened. She walked absent-mindedly down the hallway of the building when, as she passed by the door of Thomas's office inside the jewelry store, she heard a familiar voice. She stopped. The door was ajar, and Thomas was talking on the phone with someone. Emily instinctively recoiled, pressing her back against the wall so as not to be seen. His voice was different, deeper, full of irritation. "I've already told you I'm taking care of it," Thomas growled, clearly irritated. "Don't pressure me. If I need to silence someone, I'll silence them. I don't have time for threats right now." Emily's eyes widened, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't understand everything he was saying, but the way he spoke, the cold and impatient tone, made it clear it was something bad. She felt a knot in her stomach. Without making a sound, she moved away from the door and ran down the hallway, swallowing her fear. Thomas was dangerous. She didn't know exactly how, but she knew he was responsible for what happened to her mother. And what if Julie had been right all along? If he had set everything up, Emily knew she needed to tell Julie. The danger was real, and time was running out. Julie knew she was walking a fine line between uncovering the truth and getting caught. After nearly being discovered at the cafe, she decided she needed to act with more caution. That night would be decisive. She parked her car even further away, making sure Thomas wouldn't notice her, and prepared her camera and audio recording app. Her goal was clear: to get an irrefutable confession. When Thomas arrived, he seemed even more tense than on previous days. He looked around every minute as if expecting to be followed. Julie held her breath when she saw the intimidating man approach and sit at the table. This time, they wasted no time with formalities. The cartel enforcer tossed an envelope onto the table and crossed his arms. his gaze impatient. "This doesn't cover everything," the man said in a low, threatening tone. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut and rubbed his forehead, visibly nervous. "I know, but I'm working on it. I managed to sell a few pieces, but I can't raise suspicions now. I've already taken Sarah out of the way. The store is mine. Give me a few more days." Julie felt her heart race. The recording was clear. The loan shark leaned over the table, his expression becoming even more dangerous. "You think I care about that? You took the jewels, framed the wrong woman, but you still haven't settled your debt with me. I don't deal with delays, Thomas." The confirmation was like an electric shock to Julie. He had admitted it. He confessed everything. Her body trembled with adrenaline as she kept the phone steady, recording every word spoken. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I said I'm taking care of it. A few more sales, and I'll cover everything. Sarah won't be getting out of prison anytime soon. Margaret believes she did it, and so does the police." Julie felt a mixture of disgust and relief hearing those words come out of Thomas's mouth. He spoke carelessly, unaware that at that moment he was digging his own ruin. Every sentence that came out of his mouth was another piece of the trap he had set for himself. She clutched the phone tightly, ensuring the recording was being captured without fail. Now she had exactly what she needed. That evidence would not only free Sarah, but ensure that Thomas was exposed as the criminal he was. He couldn't escape. Finally, justice was within reach. The tension grew like an impending storm. Sarah's case, which had been unfolding slowly before, now took an unexpected turn. Julie received the news upon checking the court website. The trial date had been moved up. Her heart raced. That meant less time to gather evidence, fewer chances to ensure Sarah had a fair defense. She grabbed her phone and, without hesitation, dialed the number of the public defender assigned to the case. "We cannot allow this to happen. I have proof. I have a recording where Thomas confesses that he framed Sarah." "This could change everything," she said, feeling the urgency in her voice. On the other side of the line, the lawyer sighed. "If it's a legitimate recording, we can try to include it in the proceedings, but it takes time. Additionally, we need to verify if it's admissible in court. We can't just throw in evidence like that without proper legal backing." Julie closed her eyes and massaged her temples. "But the trial has been moved up. We don't have time." "I know, but getting a private lawyer who will accept this evidence would be the best option," he responded, showing little enthusiasm. Julie knew the public defender wasn't invested in the case. He was just another overworked defender, dealing with dozens of cases at the same time. If Sarah wanted a real chance to get out of there, she would need a lawyer who truly cared. But hiring someone like that required money, and she didn't have any. While trying to deal with the urgency of the case, Thomas, on the other hand, continued his dirty scheme. Inside the jewelry store's office, he carefully examined a velvet case containing diamond earrings and rings. His gaze was cold and calculating. He picked up the phone and quickly dialed. "The pieces are set aside. I want you to meet me at the agreed location in an hour," he said, clutching the case tightly. The man's voice on the other end of the line sounded impatient. "It better be enough this time, Thomas. You're already pushing my patience to the limit." Thomas swallowed hard and looked around to ensure no one was listening. Since Sarah had been removed, Margaret trusted him blindly, which facilitated his movements. But now every minute counted. He needed to sell more jewelry before everything crumbled. Meanwhile, Julie drove through the city, making frantic calls to try to find a lawyer who would take the case. But the answer was always the same. Either the fees were too high, or there wasn't enough time for a new defense. Frustration grew within her. She knew Thomas was on the verge of a breakdown, the pressure on him increasing every moment. His trembling hands, faltering voice, and restless eyes betrayed that he was about to collapse. But Julie also knew that didn't mean immediate victory. There were still risks, still the possibility that he would attempt one last ploy to escape the truth. Every second lost could be the difference between Sarah's freedom or her wrongful conviction. Time was against them, and any slip could cost everything. The battle had only just begun, and Julie couldn't fail. Julie felt the weight of every passing minute. Sarah's trial was getting closer, and the chances of presenting the evidence she had collected were dwindling with each day. Her only hope was that recording. It was the key piece to unmasking Thomas and freeing her friend. With her phone always in hand, she made copies, reviewed the audio, and ensured the file was secure. But fate seemed determined to test her resilience. That afternoon, after another failed attempt to find a lawyer who would take the case, Julie hurriedly left a small law office. Her heart raced, gripped by a mixture of frustration and fear. As she walked to her car, the phone slipped from her hands, hitting the concrete sidewalk. The sound of impact echoed like a gunshot in her ears. Her stomach churned. Julie picked up the device, desperate. The screen was shattered, and trying to turn it on, nothing happened. "No, not now," she murmured, feeling panic rising in her throat. She ran back inside the building, asking where she could find technical assistance, but the answer she received was devastating. "Your device is compromised. We can try to recover it, but without any guarantees." She left the place with teary eyes. Had she lost everything? All her work, all the evidence against Thomas, all the sacrifice to prove Sarah's innocence? She sat in the car, her hands trembling. For the first time in days, she felt that maybe she couldn't win this battle. But then, a glimmer of hope. Her old cell phone was synced to the cloud. The files should have been automatically saved. Julie grabbed the new phone she used only for calls and accessed her account. Her heart pounded, sweat running down her neck as she typed in the password. When the screen loaded and the backup appeared, she saw the files intact. She laughed nervously, tears streaming down her face. "I have the recording," she said to herself, still in shock. She hadn't lost anything. Fate hadn't won yet. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Sarah sat on the thin mattress, staring at the cold walls around her. The days there blended into a suffocating monotony. At first, she struggled to keep hope, but each postponed hearing, each indifferent look from the lawyers made her lose strength. "Maybe I'll never get out of here," she thought, feeling a lump tighten her throat. The weight of that injustice was unbearable. Sarah felt every second behind bars as a relentless torture, a cruel sentence for a crime she didn't commit. The cell seemed smaller with each passing day, suffocating as if the walls were closing in around her. But the worst wasn't the prison. The worst was knowing that Emily was out there, suffering, facing alone a world that seemed unfair and cruel. Her daughter needed her and she couldn't do anything. Her chest tightened more and more, a growing anguish that consumed her. How was Emily coping with all of this? Was she eating properly? Could she still smile? Or did she curl up in bed every night, feeling fear and longing? Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to contain the throbbing pain within her, but she couldn't stop a silent tear from sliding down her face, wetting the cold, rough prison pillow. Across town, Emily was also suffering. The nights had become an endless torment. The girl had recurring nightmares, confusing and frightening images that repeated in her fragile mind. She saw her mother being taken away by the police over and over, the flashes of the patrol cars illuminating her terrified face. She dreamed of Thomas laughing, mocking, while voices accused Sarah of something she didn't do. Fear consumed her, and when she woke up, her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Startled, sweaty, and shaking, Emily sat up in bed with panicked, wide eyes. Before she could scream, Julie came running into the room, her hair disheveled from rushing, her expression laden with worry. "It was just a dream, dear. I'm here with you," she said, enveloping Emily in a tight embrace, trying to calm her. But Emily knew it wasn't just a dream. Reality was worse than any nightmare, and she knew that if they didn't do something soon, she would never get her mother back. Julie spent the night organizing all the evidence she had collected. Every piece of information needed to be perfectly aligned, ready to be used at the right moment. Sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes burning with fatigue, she reviewed the files on her laptop, checking every detail. The recording where Thomas confessed to framing Sarah was secure, and she had made multiple backups to avoid further mishaps. In addition, he gathered the photos from the cafe where he met with the cartel collector, the images of his nervousness, and the video where he handed over an envelope full of money. Everything was there. Now all that remained was to find the right way to present that to the justice system. She sighed, running her hands over her face. Time was against them, but hope had been reborn. For the first time since Sarah's imprisonment, Julie felt she really had a chance to reverse that injustice. The following morning, she took Emily to visit her mother in prison. The girl's heart raced as they walked through the cold corridors of the penitentiary. It was always a shock to see her there, on the other side of the glass, with her tired gaze and trembling hands clutching the phone in the booth. But this time, Emily didn't just want to cry. She had something to say. Sarah picked up the phone and smiled despite her haggard face. "My princess, how are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice soft. Emily gripped the phone tightly, her eyes determined. "Mom, I know you didn't do anything, and I promise I'll fight for you," she said, her voice laden with emotion. "Aunt Julie has proof. I saw everything. Thomas is a liar, and he'll pay for what he did." Sarah blinked in surprise. She looked at Julie on the other side of the glass, who simply nodded in confirmation. "We have everything, Sarah. It's all ready. Now we just need to find a lawyer who really wants to fight for you, Julie said, feeling a lump in her throat. Sarah felt her eyes well up, and this time it wasn't just sadness or despair. It was hope. For the first time since it all began, she truly believed she could get out of there, that perhaps this nightmare was finally coming to an end. The tightness in her chest that had suffocated her for so long seemed to diminish, giving way to a feeling she had almost forgotten, the possibility of a future with Emily. "Thank you, my love. Thank you for never giving up on me," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. She reached out, gently cupping her daughter's face, as if she wanted to etch every detail of that moment into her memory. A solitary tear rolled down her cheek, but this time it wasn't one of pain. It was a relief to know she wasn't alone, that her daughter was fighting for her with all the strength of her little heart. Emily, her eyes shining and full of conviction, firmly grasped her mother's hands. "I'll never give up, Mommy. Never," she said, her small voice laden with an unbreakable certainty. In that moment, Sarah felt something shift inside her. A new strength arose in her chest, as if her daughter's words were a shield against all the injustice surrounding her. If Emily believed in her with such certainty, then she too needed to believe. She needed to fight. She needed to get out of there, because her daughter was waiting for her, and Sarah would not let her down. The tension in the air was almost palpable. The eve of Sarah's trial had arrived, and Julie knew this was the last chance to ensure the truth was heard in court. The night was silent in the apartment, except for the sound of Julie's hands gliding over the tablet screen as she reviewed the files one more time. Emily, sitting at the table beside her, watched every move with rapt attention, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. Julie took a deep breath before turning the tablet towards Emily. "You have to show this to the judge at the right moment," she said, pointing to the main recording. "If they try to ignore the evidence, you need to insist. Tell them this could save your mother, that they can't make a decision without hearing what we have." Emily nodded resolutely, pressing her lips together. "I'll do it," she replied, with a maturity that belied her young age. "Thomas can't win. I won't let him." Julie smiled faintly, gently touching the girl's hand. "I know you're brave, Emily, and I know your mother would be very proud of you." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Thomas sat comfortably in the jeweler's office, savoring a glass of whiskey. Margaret sat across from him, still downcast, but trying to convince herself that she had made the right decision by trusting him. "Finally, everything will go back to normal," said Thomas, clasping his hands on the table. "Tomorrow Sarah will be convicted, and this whole matter will finally be behind us. The store needs to move forward." Margaret sighed, running her hand through her hair. "I just wish this had never happened," she murmured, looking at the display window across the room. "Sarah meant so much to me. I still can't understand how she was capable of doing something like this." Thomas leaned forward, feigning empathy. "Margaret, you need to accept the truth. Some people deceive us for years. It was difficult for me too, but now we need to think about the future. The jewelry store will continue to grow under my leadership." Margaret nodded slowly, seeming resigned, but deep down something inside her still hesitated to fully accept that narrative. Far away, in a dark, secluded alley, Thomas hurried out of his car with rushed steps. The cartel's debt collector was already waiting for him, leaning against the wall, slowly puffing on a cigarette. "You're late," said the man, his voice devoid of emotion. Thomas swallowed hard and extended an envelope. "Here's another part of the payment. After tomorrow's trial, I can get the rest." The collector took the envelope with the cruel calm of someone who knew he was in control of the situation. He opened it with firm, experienced fingers, removing the bills and counting them slowly, one by one, unhurriedly. The sound of the paper sliding between his fingers seemed to echo in Thomas's ears, each count increasing his anxiety. He felt sweat beading on his forehead, but remained motionless, trying to maintain his composure. When the man finished counting, he raised his cold eyes to Thomas, analyzing him like a predator observing prey about to be slaughtered. His gaze was devoid of patience, tolerance, or any trace of compassion. "I don't want excuses," he said, his voice low and firm, as if each word carried an implicit threat. "I want my money. You have until tomorrow night." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, to say that he needed a little more time, that Sarah's trial had not yet ended, that he would have the necessary funds soon, but something in the debt collector's posture made him swallow hard. The man leaned slightly forward, his eyes sharp as blades. "If you don't resolve this, I'll resolve it myself." A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine. He already knew what that meant. There was no more room for mistakes, no one else to run to. Sarah's trial was his last chance. If he couldn't get rid of that debt, there might not be a future for him. The clock showed almost midnight, but in Julie's apartment, no one could sleep. Emily sat on the couch with her legs crossed, the tablet on her lap, watching Thomas's recording over and over again. Every word he said became etched in her mind. She knew she couldn't make a mistake. She knew she couldn't let herself be intimidated by the court, the adults, the fear of speaking in front of so many people. Julie sat down beside the girl, holding a cup of hot tea that she had barely touched. Her gaze was fixed on the laptop screen, where the folders of videos, audios, and photos were perfectly organized. The plan was clear. As soon as they had the opportunity, they would present the evidence in the most impactful way possible. "Shall we rehearse again?" Julie asked, trying to sound calm, but her tone carried the tension of responsibility. Emily nodded, straightening her posture. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and began. "Your Honor, I know I'm just a child, but my mother is not guilty. I've brought evidence that shows the truth," she said, exactly as they had agreed. She opened the tablet and pretended to play the recording. "Here's a video where Mr. Thomas confesses that he set my mother up." Julie smiled slightly and nodded. "Very good. But remember, Emily, you need to look directly at the judge, not at the tablet, and speak slowly so he understands every word." The girl bit her lower lip and nodded. "I know, but what if they don't let me speak? What if they try to interrupt me?" Julie held her small hands and squeezed them gently. "You can't let that happen. If they try to interrupt, tell them that this evidence could save your mother. Tell them they can't decide anything without hearing what you have to say." Emily swallowed hard and clenched her fists. "I'll do it. I promise. I'll do it." While the girl rehearsed, Julie went back to her laptop and checked the files again. Every video, every audio, every image was organized in separate folders, ready to be presented. Nothing could go wrong now. In prison, Sarah sat on the small concrete bench, staring at the worn wall in front of her. The sound of the iron doors opening echoed through the hallways, but she barely registered the noises. Tomorrow would be the day that would decide her life. The prison guard banged on the bars and motioned for her to get up. "Time for trial prep," she announced, her voice devoid of emotion. Sarah took a deep breath, stood up, and followed down the corridor to the small room where her lawyer was waiting. The man adjusted the papers in front of him and motioned for her to sit down. "Mrs. Carter, the trial has been moved up, which means we'll have less time to argue," he said as he looked over some documents. "The evidence presented so far is circumstantial, so we need to be prepared for a possible conviction." Sarah felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. "What do you mean, a possible conviction? I'm innocent." The lawyer sighed, took off his glasses and massaged his temples. "I understand, but the judicial system isn't perfect. The case against you seems strong. If the judge sees the evidence as sufficient, he may find you guilty." Sarah felt her stomach churn. "And what happens if I'm convicted?" The lawyer looked at her seriously, his eyes reflecting a mixture of realism and concern. "If that happens, we can appeal, but it could take months or even years to review the case." The impact of those words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. The air left her lungs, her vision blurred for an instant. Months, years. The idea of losing so much time, of watching Emily grow up without her presence, of not being there to help her with homework, to see her sleep peacefully, or just hold her little hand in difficult moments, it was unbearable. "I can't be away from my daughter for so long," she said, her voice coming out trembling, almost a whisper. The lawyer, sensing the despair in her eyes, leaned forward, trying to sound more encouraging. "What I can say is, stay calm. Only answer what they ask. Don't show despair, as it could undermine your credibility. The court needs to see you as someone steadfast, confident in your innocence. And most importantly, remember that there are people fighting for you." Sarah closed her eyes, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. With each passing day, each brief visit from Emily, each cold night inside that cell, the feeling of helplessness grew. But she knew she couldn't falter. Not now. That night, lying on the narrow bed, staring at the peeling ceiling of the prison, Sarah made a promise to herself. Her breathing was deep, and her voice came out firm, even if only to herself. "I'm going to get out of here. One way or another, I'm going to get out of here. Emily needs me. I won't give up." The silent night advanced, but Emily's room remained illuminated only by the small lamp beside her bed. The girl was huddled under the covers, clutching a worn photograph of her mother against her chest. Her fingers gently traced over Sarah's face in the image, as if she could somehow feel her presence through the paper. Her eyes burned from holding back tears, and her heart seemed to beat slowly, heavy with fear and longing. She tried to close her eyes, but every time she did, flashes of the prison appeared in her mind. The orange uniform, the cold bars, her mother's sad look on the other side of the glass. How could she sleep knowing that the next day she might never see her free again? Julie, sitting at the kitchen table, glanced at the clock for the fourth time in less than an hour. Time seemed to drag on, as if mocking her anxiety. The tablet was in front of her, the evidence already organized, but the feeling that something could still go wrong tormented her. With a tired sigh, she opened the files once more, checking each video, each audio, each image. She needed absolute certainty that everything was ready, that nothing was missing. The trial was Sarah's only chance, and any mistake could mean her definitive conviction. She adjusted the headphones on her ears and played Thomas's recording again, listening intently to every word. "I've already taken care of Sarah. The store is mine. Give me a few more days." His voice sounded more repulsive each time she heard it. She closed her eyes for a moment and massaged her temples. She knew she needed to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. She looked into the living room and saw Emily, now sitting on the bed, still hugging the photograph, her gaze fixed on the window. Her chest tightened at the sight of her like that. The girl was exhausted, but anguish prevented her from sleeping. Julie rose slowly and walked to the bedroom, sitting beside her. "You need to sleep, dear. Tomorrow will be an important day," she said, tenderly brushing Emily's hair back. Emily sniffled and clutched the photo even tighter to her chest, her tiny fingers trembling as she gripped the crumpled image of her mother. The fear she felt was so great that her chest ached, as if something heavy was pressing against her heart. Her mind spun with unanswered questions, all haunted by the possibility of failure. What if the judge doesn't believe me? What if they don't let me show the recording? Her voice came out choked, fragile, laden with uncertainty. Her eyes glistened with tears that threatened to fall at any moment. Julie watched the girl with a tightness in her chest. Emily was so small to carry such a heavy weight. It shouldn't be her who needed to fight to prove her own mother's innocence. It was unfair, cruel, but there the girl was, holding on to the hope of a better future with all her might. Julie took Emily's small hands in hers and smiled tenderly, even though she felt a tight knot in her own throat. "You are stronger than you know, Emily. You know the truth, and the truth always finds a way to come out." The girl still trembled, her lips parted in a small sigh of doubt. "But what if no one listens to me? I'm just a child." Julie brushed the hair from her face, trying to calm her. "Being a child doesn't mean your voice doesn't matter. It means your heart is pure, and everyone will see the sincerity in what you say. The important thing is that you speak from the heart, that you look the judge in the eye and say exactly how you feel. No one can ignore the truth when it comes from someone like you." Emily nodded slightly, but the fear was still there, hidden behind her tired eyes. Julie pulled the blanket over the girl, tucking it in gently. "Now try to rest. Tomorrow will be an important day." Emily slowly closed her eyes, but her little hand still clutched her mother's photograph, as if it were a talisman against everything that frightened her. Julie remained seated by the bedside, watching the girl's breathing gradually calm down. The sobs subsided until at last she fell asleep. Julie stayed there for a few more minutes, hearing only the soft sound of the night and the peaceful rhythm of Emily's breathing. She wanted to ensure that the girl was truly asleep, that at least on that night she would have some peace. Then she rose slowly, trying not to make a sound, and walked to the bedroom door. Upon reaching the kitchen, she looked at the table where the papers, tablet, and all the evidence she had gathered were scattered. She sighed deeply and rubbed her face, feeling the weariness weighing on her shoulders. There was no room for error. The next day, everything had to go perfectly. Nothing could go wrong. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied by curious onlookers, journalists, and people anxiously awaiting the outcome of that trial. A low murmur echoed through the polished wooden walls, and the cold lighting of the room made everything even more oppressive. In the center of the hall, Sarah was seated next to her defense attorney, her handcuffed wrists resting on her lap. Her face was haggard, her deep-set eyes heavy with fatigue, but what drew the most attention was her expression of resignation. It seemed that within her, hope was dissolving little by little. On the other side of the room, Thomas remained upright, wearing an impeccable suit and a well-rehearsed, serious expression. The confidence in his gaze was not that of an innocent man, but of someone who believed he had complete control of the situation. Margaret was seated in the front row, her face tense and her lips pressed into a thin line. Despite everything, there was a silent conflict in her gaze, a part of her that still hesitated to believe that Sarah was truly guilty. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone stood up, following protocol. As soon as he took his place, the trial officially began. The prosecutor was the first to speak, rising with a firm posture. "Your Honor, We are facing a clear case of betrayal and aggravated theft. The accused, Sarah Carter, used her position of trust to misappropriate valuable jewelry from the jewelry store where she worked for 15 years. Today, we will present irrefutable evidence that proves her guilt. Sarah lowered her head even further. She felt the heavy stares upon her, but the worst of all was imagining what Emily must be feeling at that moment. The little girl was sitting in the back row next to Julie and tried to remain strong, but her eyes glistened with restrained tears. The first witness was called Margaret. She walked to the witness stand, adjusting her skirt and taking a deep breath before facing the judge. The prosecutor approached, quickly flipping through his papers before starting the questions. Mrs. Margaret, please tell us how long the accused has been working for you, and what was your relationship with her? Margaret swallowed hard before answering. Sarah worked for me for 15 years. I trusted her as if she were part of my family. She was always dedicated, punctual, efficient. I never imagined she could do something like this. The prosecutor nodded, walking slowly around the room. And how did you discover that jewelry was disappearing from your store? Margaret adjusted her glasses and sighed. I did an inventory audit and noticed that some valuable pieces were missing. Initially, I thought it was a mistake, so we recounted more than once. It was then that Thomas found the jewelry in Sarah's locker. The prosecutor turned to the audience and gestured convincingly. In other words, the jewelry was kept in the accused's locker. Given this, ma'am, as the owner of the jewelry store, do you believe Sarah is guilty? Margaret hesitated. For a brief moment, her eyes met Sarah's, who watched her in silence, pleading for a glimpse of doubt, for a single spark of uncertainty. But in the end, Margaret merely nodded. Yes, I trusted her and was betrayed. The murmurs grew louder among those present, and Sarah closed her eyes for an instant, feeling the weight of that statement crush her. Julie held Emily's hand, who clenched her fists tightly, fighting back tears. Now it was Thomas's turn. He walked to the front of the room, his posture impeccable, a small smirk on his lips. He seemed confident, as if he were playing a role he had rehearsed exhaustively. The prosecutor handed him some documents and asked him to describe the events of that day. I have always admired Sarah as a professional, Thomas began, glancing at Margaret as if reinforcing his credibility. I never imagined something like this could happen, but unfortunately, the facts leave no room for doubt. He walked slowly around the room, his voice controlled and laden with a persuasive tone. I myself found the missing jewels inside Sarah's closet. When confronted, her reaction was one of despair, but she could not provide a convincing explanation. Furthermore, we reviewed the security cameras, and although the images do not directly show the theft, it is clear that no one other than her had access to the vault area during that period. The prosecutor smiled discreetly, satisfied with the narrative. In other words, the accused was the only person with the opportunity to commit this crime. Thomas nodded with conviction. Yes, and I deeply regret that this has happened. The judge analyzed the notes, and Sarah felt her breathing becoming shorter and shorter. The case against her seemed impeccable. Margaret considered her guilty. Thomas presented convincing evidence, and now everything seemed to be turning against her. Emily looked at Julie in despair. What if they don't let me speak? What if the judge decides before I show the video? Julie firmly held Sarah's shoulder, trying to convey some sense of security, but inside she felt her own anxiety growing by the second. Her heart was beating hard, and her breathing was short, as if the courtroom had become too small an environment to contain all the tension that hung in the air. She knew they were close to turning the game around, but she also knew that any mistake could cost Sarah her freedom. She knelt slightly beside her friend, keeping her voice low and firm. It will be all right. Wait for the right moment, she whispered, trying to remain calm even though her mind screamed with worry. Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. Her fingers gripped the table in front of her, trying to contain the slight tremor that insisted on betraying her. The fear was still there, but something inside her refused to give in. For the first time, she saw a real chance to escape that nightmare, to reclaim her life. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Thomas sat back down, crossing his arms with a discreet, self-satisfied smile. His gaze was loaded with arrogance, his expression relaxed as if he already knew the outcome of that hearing. He believed he had won, that his plan had unfolded exactly as it should, but what he didn't know was that the truth was about to come out. The trap he had set himself was about to close on him, and when it did, there would be no escape. The courtroom was in absolute silence, the tension hanging in the air like an impending storm. Sarah remained downcast, her wrists still handcuffed, listening intently to every word spoken against her. Her heart no longer raced as before. So it was as if, with each testimony, each manipulated piece of evidence, she accepted that perhaps there was no longer any escape. Thomas, sitting with impeccable posture, observed everything with a controlled gaze. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, about to proceed with the trial, when a sudden noise echoed down the hallway. The sound of hurried footsteps approached rapidly, and before anyone could react, Emily came running down the corridor, her hair disheveled and her eyes wide with desperation. Her small hands clutched the tablet tightly against her chest as she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "Please, Your Honor, don't imprison my mother. She is innocent." Her voice was trembling, but it was laden with determination. The sudden invasion left everyone stunned. The judge frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption, while the prosecutor looked from side to side, as if trying to understand where that girl had come from. Thomas, who until then had maintained an expression of absolute control, visibly paled. His eyes went straight to the tablet, and the rigidity of his shoulders indicated the growing panic inside him. The judge banged his gavel on the table, trying to restore order. "This is a courtroom, not a school. Who allowed this child to enter here?" Julie emerged right behind Emily, her face tense but determined. "My apologies, Your Honor, but this girl has something very important to show, something that could change everything in this trial." The prosecutor immediately stood up, his posture rigid. "This is unacceptable. We cannot allow this child to interfere with the proceedings of the court. We are dealing with a serious case." Emily gripped the tablet even tighter, her eyes welling up, but not giving in to fear. "But this is serious. If you don't listen to what I have to say, you'll arrest the wrong person." Sarah, who until then had no strength to speak, raised her head, her heart racing to see her daughter there, facing all those adults without hesitation. "Emily," she murmured, feeling her chest tighten with emotion and fear at the same time. The judge sighed, adjusting his glasses again. "Young lady, do you understand that you are in a courtroom? This is not a place for games." Emily nodded quickly, wiping away the tears that threatened to run down her face. "Yes, Your Honor, I know it's serious, but no one wants to listen to me. I have evidence. I can prove my mother didn't steal anything." The prosecutor rolled his eyes impatiently. "And what exactly does this child intend to show?" Julie stepped forward and took a flash drive out of her pocket. "This recording contains a clear confession from Thomas. He himself admits that he framed Sarah. He stole the jewels, he planted the evidence, he deceived all of you." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "This is ridiculous. Are a child barging into the courtroom with a video that could have been tampered with? We cannot accept that as evidence." The judge observed Thomas with an appraising look before turning to Emily. "If what you have is truly evidence, we need to analyze it. But understand, child, this does not mean your mother will be released immediately." Emily gripped the tablet tighter. "I just want you to listen. Please." The judge hesitated for a moment before gesturing to the court's technical assistant. "Project the contents of the tablet for everyone to see." The atmosphere became even more tense. Everyone in the room held their breath as the assistant connected the device to the court system. The giant screen behind the judge lit up, and the recording began to play. The video showed Thomas sitting in a cafe talking on the phone, his voice clearly audible. "I've already told you I'm taking care of it. I need more time, but this debt will be paid. I've gotten rid of one problem, I don't need another." The audio continued, and the court heard every word spoken by Thomas. "The store is still under control. Without Sarah here, no one suspects a thing. Just a little more, and I'll get what I need." There was complete silence in the courtroom. Margaret's eyes widened, looking at Thomas as if she were seeing him for the first time. The prosecutor frowned, beginning to realize that something was very wrong. The final blow came with the second excerpt from the recording. "I've already taken Sarah out of the way. The store is mine. Give me a few more days." Thomas abruptly stood up, his skin pale as paper. "This proves nothing. That recording could have been edited, tampered with. This is an outrage." The judge banged his gavel, ordering silence. "Mr. Thomas, sit down immediately. Let's examine this evidence carefully." Margaret, still in shock, slowly turned to Thomas. You've been lying to me this whole time." Her voice was low, filled with disbelief and betrayal. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. For the first time since the beginning of this nightmare, the truth was being heard. Her eyes went straight to Emily, who was now trembling slightly but maintained her firm posture. The judge took a deep breath and turned to the prosecutor. "In light of this new evidence, does the prosecution still wish to proceed with the case in the same manner?" The prosecutor looked uncomfortable, quickly flipping through his papers. "We need time to analyze the authenticity of the audio, Your Honor, but if it's legitimate, There's a real risk we've accused the wrong person. Julie squeezed Emily's shoulder, a discreet smile appearing on her lips. The first step had been taken. Thomas's plan was starting to unravel. The judge sighed deeply, adjusting his glasses on his nose before raising the gavel and striking the wood, the sound echoing through the courtroom like an undeniable warning. The murmur among those present increased for a few seconds before he raised his hand, demanding silence. His firm gaze swept the room before turning back to the prosecution and defense. "We will take a recess to verify this recording. This court needs the truth, not assumptions," he declared, his voice laden with authority and gravity. The impact of his words reverberated through the courtroom. Thomas sank back in his chair as if the weight of the world had fallen upon his shoulders. His shoulders were tense, his breathing short and rapid. His gaze swept the courtroom, but found no refuge anywhere. What had once seemed an assured victory, a well-orchestrated plan that would keep him safe and Sarah behind bars, was now becoming a trap, a cage built by his own hands. He felt the mounting pressure, the invisible walls closing in around him. Sarah, in turn, kept her eyes fixed on the table before her, trying to contain the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Throughout this entire process, she had been crushed by fear, uncertainty, and a sense of powerlessness. But now, for the first time, she felt there was a light at the end of that dark tunnel. Her heart beat stronger, not from despair, but from hope. She raised her gaze and met Julie's eyes, who even from across the room held a discreet, encouraging smile. Emily, small and anxious, gripped her godmother's hands tightly, as if her life depended on the answer to come. Sarah didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time she believed the truth would finally be heard. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. All eyes were fixed on the screen where the video continued to play. Thomas's voice filled the room, each word echoing like a blow against his credibility. The air seemed heavy, and even the judge, who always remained impassive, leaned slightly forward, interested in what was to come. The recording advanced to an even more damning segment. Now the scene showed Thomas in a discreet meeting at a remote cafe. Across the table, the cartel collector shuffled through an envelope stuffed with cash, while Thomas rubbed his sweaty palms. "This doesn't cover it all," the man said, his voice laden with threat. Thomas took a deep breath before responding, his insecurity evident. "I know, but I'm resolving it. I got rid of Sarah. The store's in my hands now. Just a little more and I'll pay everything off." The reaction in the courtroom was immediate. A murmur took over the rows, and some people put their hands over their mouths, shocked by what they had just heard. Margaret, who until then had maintained a rigid posture, brought her hand to her chest, her face taken by an expression of disbelief. Her eyes filled with tears, and she slowly shook her head. "My God," she murmured, almost voiceless. The video continued, and Thomas's voice became clearer and clearer. "I planted the jewels in her closet. No one would ever suspect me. That court is going to convict her tomorrow, and all of this will just be a problem of the past." The collector chuckled softly. "As long as my money is here, I don't care who goes to jail." The last words sealed Thomas's fate. In court, the judge raised his hand and banged the gavel against the table, restoring order. "This is a direct confession," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. "Thomas, stand up." Thomas, however, did not move. His face was pale, as if all the blood had drained from his skin. His wide eyes were fixed on the screen, blinking rapidly, unable to believe what had just happened. A tremor ran through his hands, his fingers clenched in a trembling grip on the wooden table. He tried to speak, to open his mouth to defend himself, deny, shout anything that could reverse that situation, but no sound came out. The knot in his throat tightened, sweat ran down his forehead, and before he could articulate any words, his body gave way. The entire hall held its breath when Thomas collapsed against the table, the dull thud echoing through the courtroom like a sudden clap of thunder. His body tilted to the side, limp, making the chairs creak on impact. For a moment, everything stood still as if time had stopped. Some of those present brought their hands to their mouths. Others looked at each other, unsure if what they had just witnessed was real. The judge himself fell silent for a second, assessing the situation, before calling the officers to check on his condition. The shock spread among those present, creating an atmosphere of disbelief. Some people cried discreetly, the emotion of the moment weighing on them like an impossible burden to contain. There were those who murmured softly, trying to understand what had just happened, and others who merely observed the scene, completely paralyzed. Emily, however, didn't care about the commotion around her, the courtroom, the murmurs, the expressions of surprise. Nothing mattered beyond what her heart longed to hear. Her eyes scanned the room, seeking only one person. Her little heart raced, beating hard against her chest, and then, unable to hold back the anguish, she ran to Julie, burying her face against her shoulder. Her small body trembled with emotion, and tears streamed uncontrollably. "Is Mommy going to be released?" she whispered, her voice fragile and full of hope, as if, at that moment, she desperately needed confirmation to believe that it was real. Julie held the girl tightly against herself, feeling tears also welling up in her own eyes. She ran her hands through Emily's hair, seeking to comfort her, while looking at Sarah, still seated, but visibly overcome with emotion. She didn't need to think twice before answering, her voice carrying certainty and relief. "Yes, dear, the truth prevailed." And, at that moment, Emily let out a sob, finally feeling the weight of fear being lifted from her shoulders. Sarah would be released. They would be together again. The truth, despite everything, had prevailed. The courtroom was in complete uproar. Murmurs echoed through every corner as the judge firmly struck the gavel on the desk, demanding silence. The image of Thomas lying unconscious on the table only heightened the tension in the room. Officers quickly approached, trying to revive him, but he soon regained consciousness, blinking several times before realizing the gravity of the situation. His face was pale, his breathing erratic, and his hands visibly trembling. The judge adjusted his glasses, analyzed the documents in front of him, and took a deep breath before speaking. After watching this recording and hearing Mr. Thomas's direct confession, it is evident that the accused, Sarah Carter, was wrongfully incriminated. He paused and looked directly at the officers beside the defendant. "Immediate arrest order for Thomas. He will be detained and held accountable for his actions." Thomas widened his eyes and tried to stand up, but one of the officers was already at his side, firmly holding his arms to handcuff him. "This is a mistake. That recording could have been tampered with," he shouted desperately, trying to break free. But there was no escape. The prosecutor, who had until then sustained the accusation against Sarah, rubbed his face, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. "The defendant's arguments are invalid," declared the judge. "The recording presented contains incontrovertible evidence that he orchestrated this entire charade to cover up his own crimes." He turned to Sarah, who was still seated, motionless, trying to absorb what was happening. "Mrs. Carter, stand up." She obeyed mechanically, her heart racing. The handcuffs still weighed on her wrists, the cold metal reminding her of every day spent in prison. The judge gave a slight nod to one of the officers standing beside him. "Remove the handcuffs. This woman is innocent and should never have been imprisoned." The click of the metal coming undone was like a breath of freedom for Sarah. As soon as she felt the weight disappear from her wrists, she massaged the red marks on her skin, unable to hold back her tears. Emily, who had been watching everything from the back row, let out a loud sob before running forward. "Mommy!" Sarah barely had time to react before feeling her daughter's little arms wrap around her waist. She immediately knelt down, holding Emily, as if she would never let her go again. "My love, it's over. It's over," she murmured through tears, burying her face in the girl's hair. Margaret, on the other hand, remained seated, static, as if her body had lost the ability to react. The courtroom around her seemed distant, the murmurs blending into a muffled buzz as her mind processed in shock everything that had just happened. Her gaze alternated between Sarah, who was now free, and Thomas, who was being dragged away by the police, his wrists bound in cold handcuffs. Never, not even in her worst nightmares, did she imagine she would see that scene before her eyes. She had always considered herself a good judge of character. For years she believed she knew the people around her well, that she could distinguish who was trustworthy and who was not. But now the truth was revealed in a cruel way, stripping her of any trace of certainty. Everything she thought she knew crumbled there, in that courtroom. The weight of guilt was crushing. "My God," she whispered, feeling a tremor run through her hands as she brought them to her face. Her voice barely came out, but the despair and regret were etched into every line of her expression. "What have I done?" Margaret felt a tightness in her chest, a suffocating sensation that prevented her from breathing properly. It wasn't just guilt. It was the realization that she had been an accomplice, albeit an unwitting one, to the suffering of an innocent woman. She had allowed Thomas to manipulate her. She had not questioned the evidence, and in the process, she had destroyed Sarah's life. Her heart was racing, and an almost desperate desire to turn back time took hold of her. But it was too late. The reality of the injustice committed was undeniable, and at that moment, all she could feel was regret. The courtroom was still in chaos when Thomas was led away by the police officers. His face was pale, his eyes wide with desperation, but now there was nothing else he could do. The judge had already ordered his arrest, and any attempt at a defense was futile. Meanwhile, Sarah remained kneeling, hugging Emily, feeling the pressure of the past few weeks finally lifting from her shoulders. But the fight was not over yet. On the other side of the room, the prosecutor, visibly embarrassed, tried to regain his composure. In light of the new evidence presented, the prosecution acknowledges that there was a grave error in the accusation against Mrs. Carter. However, it is imperative that we further investigate this matter to uncover the extent of the crimes committed by Mr. Thomas. The judge nodded and looked at the police officers. Conduct a thorough search. If Thomas committed this crime, it is likely that there are more irregularities in his conduct. The police's mobilization was immediate. As Thomas was being led away, 2 agents left the courtroom in a hurry, armed with the necessary information to initiate a detailed search. The name of the cartel debt collector mentioned in the recording was the key piece to unraveling the entire scheme. Hours later, while Sarah and Emily were still at the courthouse, the police announced their first major discovery. "We were able to trace Thomas's bank transactions," one of the detectives said, addressing the prosecutor. "He had been embezzling money for months, selling stolen jewelry and channeling the funds into suspicious accounts. We believe the missing pieces from the jewelry store were delivered to a man identified as Carlos Mendez, a known debt collector linked to organized crime." Margaret, who was still trying to process everything, shuddered upon hearing the name. Mendez. I remember that name. Thomas mentioned working with a trusted supplier, but I never suspected anything. Julie, who remained by Sarah's side, crossed her arms and shook her head. He used everyone's trust to get rid of his own debts, and when he realized he couldn't cover up the losses anymore, he used Sarah as a scapegoat to divert attention from himself. Exactly, confirmed the officer, but now we have enough evidence to arrest Mendez as well. With Thomas's confession and the financial trail, we got a warrant to locate him. We're on our way to his last known location. The prosecutor, who until then had maintained a stern demeanor, let out a long sigh before addressing Sarah. "Mrs. Carter, I know an apology can't undo everything you've been through, but I can assure you we'll do everything in our power to make those responsible pay for what they've done." Sarah nodded slowly. She was still processing the fact that she was free. "I just want justice," she said, her voice firm. "Not just for me, but for everyone who was deceived by him." 2 hours later, the police announced the capture of Carlos Mendez. He was found in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, trying to flee with part of the stolen jewels. When interrogated, he didn't try to deny anything. "Thomas was a fool," he said with an ironic smile. "He thought he could negotiate with people like us and get away with it, but in the end he dug his own grave." With his arrest, the police finally managed to recover all the missing jewels. The pieces were handed over to Margaret, who now carried a look of deep guilt. As she received the box containing the items she had previously believed were stolen by Sarah, she looked at the woman she had known for 15 years and shook her head. "I was blind. I should have questioned everything before accusing you." Sarah watched her for a long moment, her mind divided between the weight of the past and the lightness of that instant. The wounds of injustice were still there, deep, slowly healing, but there was something stronger taking over her chest. Relief. Not the kind of momentary relief, but the one that comes after a violent storm, when the sky finally clears and the air becomes breathable again. She never imagined she would go through something so cruel, never thought the people around her could turn their backs on her so quickly. But there she was, standing firm, having proven her innocence with her daughter by her side and her dignity restored. Her name, once stained by unjust accusations, was now clean. The truth, so often suffocated by despair, had finally prevailed. Feeling her mother's silent tension, Emily squeezed her hand tighter, seeking and at the same time offering comfort. The small, delicate touch of her daughter was a powerful reminder that it had all been worth it. Sarah looked at the girl, absorbing the purity in her gaze, the strength she had shown even at such a young age throughout that ordeal. Emily smiled faintly, a shy smile, but loaded with hope. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt she could breathe again. The weight on her shoulders dissolved, making room for something new. Not just the freedom of being out of jail, but the true freedom to move forward, to rebuild her life without the weight of injustice suffocating every step. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling that new beginning filling her lungs. The afternoon sun gently entered through the courthouse windows as Sarah finally walked out the front door. The fresh air hit her face, and she took a deep breath, feeling truly free for the first time since her life had turned into a nightmare. Emily, who was a few steps ahead, didn't wait another second. With a lump caught in her throat, she ran and threw herself into her mother's arms, hugging her with all the strength her little hands could muster. "Mommy!" Emily cried, burying her face against Sarah's chest, her tears wetting her shirt. "I knew it. I knew you'd come back to me." Sarah closed her eyes and held her daughter even tighter. The warmth of that embrace seemed to dissolve every moment of pain she had experienced in the past few days. She kissed Emily's hair repeatedly, while her own breath came out trembling, trying to contain her emotion. "My love, it's over. It's really over. I'm here. I'll never leave your side again." Julie, who was watching everything up close, brought one hand to her mouth, trying to stifle her sobs. No matter how hard she had fought to prove the truth, no matter how much she knew Sarah was innocent, seeing that scene with her own eyes was a relief she couldn't express in words. She felt the tears stream freely down her face and didn't try to hide them. Sarah looked at her best friend, still holding Emily in her arms, and broke into a smile amid the tears. "You did this for me. You never gave up." Julie laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "I would never give up. You didn't deserve any of this." Margaret, who was standing a few meters back, watched the scene with a tight chest of guilt. Remorse weighed on her shoulders like an unbearable burden. Her gaze wavered between Sarah and Emily, seeing the happiness that was being reinstated in their lives, a happiness that through her blindness and haste she had almost destroyed. The faces around the courtroom expressed relief and emotion, but Margaret could only feel shame. How could she have doubted a woman who had dedicated 15 years of her life to jewelry? How could she, without questioning, have allowed Sarah to be taken to prison, separated from her daughter, from everything she loved most? She wanted to say something, find words that would be enough to make amends for what she had done. But in the intensity of that reunion, she felt out of place, almost unworthy of interrupting that moment. All she could do was take a small step forward, a hesitant gesture, as if she wanted to partake in the happiness that was being rebuilt there. But she didn't know if she would be allowed to do so. Emily, still clinging to her mother with all the strength of her little arms, raised her face, her eyes shining as if, for the first time in a long while, she believed that everything would be all right. Her face was still wet with tears, but now they were tears of relief, of a child's heart that finally felt safe again. "Now we can go home, right, Mom?" Her voice came out low, almost a whisper, as if the fear still lingered over her, as if she needed to hear this confirmation directly from her mother to believe that this was not a dream. Sarah nodded, gently caressing her daughter's face, feeling the soft skin under her fingers. Every detail of that moment was precious. Every second by Emily's side was a gift she would never take for granted again. "Yes, my love," she replied, her voice choked but filled with tenderness and certainty. "We're going home." Emily let out a deep sigh, as if, with those words, all the weight of fear and uncertainty had finally left her little body. She hugged her mother even tighter, burying herself in her lap as if she wanted to merge with her, ensuring that nothing would ever separate them again. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing that instant, feeling the warmth of her daughter's embrace, hearing the sound of her breathing, the rapid beating of her little heart. She was free. She was back with her daughter, and nothing else in the world mattered. Margaret, observing the scene, finally felt the tears she was holding back stream down her face. She didn't know if one day Sarah would forgive her for everything she did, but at that moment, she realized that nothing was stronger than the love between a mother and daughter, and that, in the end, that love prevailed. The cafeteria was silent, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee hovering in the air, while Sarah absent-mindedly stirred the spoon inside the cup. The day after the trial seemed like a distant dream. After so much suffering, injustice, and fear, she was finally free. But despite the freedom, there were still open wounds, invisible scars that needed time to heal. Emily was at home with Julie, resting after so many days of tension. And now there, sitting in front of the table, Sarah awaited someone she never imagined would have the courage to face her again. The cafe door opened, and Margaret entered hesitantly. Her eyes searched for Sarah with a mixture of guilt and hope, and upon finding her, she took a deep breath before approaching. Her demeanor no longer carried the authority it once had. Now she seemed smaller, more fragile, as if the weight of guilt had diminished her. "Sarah," she said, stopping beside the table, her voice laden with emotion. "May I sit down?" Sarah raised her eyes and studied the woman before her. She had never felt resentment towards Margaret, but the pain of betrayal still lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't dissipate. She took a deep breath and nodded, pointing to the chair across from her. Margaret sat down slowly, adjusting her coat as if trying to recompose herself. For a long moment she remained silent, her restless hands on the table. Then, finally, she found the courage to speak. "I don't even know where to begin," she said, her voice choked. "I was wrong, terribly wrong. I was wrong in a way that has no justification, and I need you to know that I have never, in my entire life, felt so ashamed." Sarah said nothing. She merely let Margaret speak. "I trusted the wrong person," Margaret continued, swallowing hard. "And in the process, I destroyed the life of someone who never gave me a reason to doubt. You stood by my side for 15 years, always faithful, always loyal, and I threw it all away because I was blind." She lowered her eyes, her hands gripping the edge of the untouched cup in front of her. "If I could go back in time, I would never have allowed this to happen, but I can't. So all that's left for me is to ask for your forgiveness." Sarah took a deep breath. The apology was sincere. She could feel it. But what hurt her most was not the accusation itself, but the fact that Margaret had believed Thomas without questioning. "Did you really believe I would be capable of something like that?" she asked, her voice laden with a sadness that Margaret couldn't bear. The woman closed her eyes for a moment and shook her head. "I wanted to believe it wasn't true, but the evidence, it was all there. I let myself be deceived." There was a long silence between the two before Margaret resumed speaking, now in a firmer tone. "I know I can't fix what I've done, but I want to try. I want to offer you the manager position at the jewelry store, and I want to compensate you financially for everything you've been through. I know nothing can erase what happened, but it's the least I can do." Sarah was surprised. She looked at Margaret, evaluating her expression, and saw no trace of pride or superiority there, only genuine remorse. She lowered her eyes to the coffee cup, watching the steam rise slowly, as if that silent motion could give her answers. The familiar aroma filled the air, but nothing seemed truly comforting. Accepting the position would mean much more than just going back to work. It would mean revisiting a place that had deeply marked her, where her life was shattered in an instant, where looks of distrust replaced years of dedication. The jewelry store had always been her livelihood, her refuge, a place where she felt safe. But now it was a space filled with painful memories. She gripped the cup handle tightly, as if she needed something to lean on. Emily needed stability, needed to know that her mother was safe, that nothing would separate them again. Sarah knew her daughter deserved a future without fear, and returning to the jewelry store could be the answer to that. But would she be ready to face it all again? To see faces that had once turned away and pretended not to know her? With a long sigh, she raised her eyes and met Margaret's gaze, which seemed hesitant, anxiously awaiting a response. The wetness in her eyes showed that guilt still consumed her. "I need some time to think," Sarah replied, her voice firm but not harsh. "But I appreciate you finally seeing the truth." Margaret smiled with visible relief, the unshed tears making her expression even more vulnerable. "Whatever you decide, I will respect it, but know that the jewelry store will always be your home." Sarah was not sure of anything yet, but for the first time since everything happened, she felt that a new beginning was possible. One step at a time. The doorbell chimed softly as Sarah entered the jewelry store for the first time since her imprisonment. The familiar scent of floral perfume in the air and the shine of the display cases, glistening under the warm ceiling lights, brought back a flood of memories. For years, this place had been her second home, a space where she built bonds, dreams, and a reputation now being restored. But something was different now. The fear of being looked at with distrust still weighed inside her, despite Margaret's public apology. For a moment, she hesitated. Emily, by her side, held her hand and looked up with a radiant smile. "You made it, Mom. Everyone will see that you belong in this place." Sarah squeezed her daughter's tiny fingers and forced a smile before taking the first step inside. As soon as the employees saw her, there was a moment of dead silence. All eyes turned to her, and Sarah felt her heart race. Then, like a wave breaking the tension, one of the saleswomen who had worked with her for years came towards her, her eyes shining with emotion. "Sarah," the woman exclaimed, and before she could react, she was enveloped in a tight hug. It was enough for the other employees and customers to approach. What she thought would be a discreet return turned into something much bigger. One by one, her co-workers came to her, some with tears in their eyes, others just murmuring words of support and relief. Some customers who were inside the store approached, showing affection. A grey-haired lady held Sarah's hands and said with a choked voice, "I always knew you would never do something like that. I always trusted you." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She expected doubtful looks, whispers, and distance, but what she found was welcoming. The people who really knew her never doubted her. That made all the difference. Margaret appeared from behind the counter, watching the scene with teary eyes. She walked up to Sarah and stood by her side, waiting for the noise to subside before speaking. "From today on, Sarah Carter is officially the manager of this jewelry store," she announced firmly. "And there is no one more deserving of this position than her." There was a murmur of surprise, followed by applause. Emily held her mother's hand even tighter, her chest swelling with pride. "I knew this would happen," she exclaimed, vibrating with joy. Sarah took her hand to her chest, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to overflow. The lump in her throat tightened in an almost painful way, but it wasn't from sadness or fear anymore. It was emotion. After everything she went through, after every cold night in prison, every look of distrust, every feeling of helplessness, being there, surrounded by people who welcomed her back with affection and respect, felt unreal. She blinked a few times, trying to absorb every detail of that moment, engraving it in her memory as a reminder that, even in the worst circumstances, the truth always finds a way to prevail. Her eyes wandered around the environment, taking in every familiar face. Some carried expressions of guilt and regret, like Margaret, who remained slightly distant but visibly emotional. Others, like her former co-workers, smiled genuinely, showing they never doubted her. And there were also the loyal customers, people who had frequented the jewelry store for years and who now came up to her with words of support, handshakes, and tight hugs. An elderly woman with graying hair held Sarah's hands and spoke with a choked voice. "I never believed it was you. You've always been the soul of this store." The affection in her words caused a new wave of emotion to engulf her completely. With a deep sigh, she felt an enormous weight dissolve within her. The fear, the insecurity, the pain of injustice. It all seemed to be replaced by something new and powerful. Hope. Finally, a new beginning. Finally, justice had been served. And now, for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt she could move forward without looking back. Night had already fallen when the jewelry store closed its doors, ending the most unexpectedly emotional day of Sarah's life. The buzz of joy still echoed inside the shop, where the employees decided to celebrate the new manager's return with an impromptu toast. It was hard to believe that, just a few days ago, she was behind bars, struggling to prove her innocence. Now she was there, surrounded by people who welcomed her, toasting to justice and a fresh start. Margaret shyly approached, holding a glass of juice in her hands, her gaze heavy with restrained emotion. The pride and rigid posture that had always characterized her seemed to have dissolved, making way for a vulnerable woman, marked by the weight of the mistake she had made. "Sarah, she hesitated, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I know that nothing I say will erase what you went through, but I wanted you to know that from the bottom of my heart, I regret everything." Sarah observed her for a long moment. The resentment she had carried in the early days began to dissipate. The pain was still there, but there was no room for resentment in the heart of someone who wanted to move forward. "I was hurt, Margaret," she said honestly, feeling the lump in her throat dissolve. "But holding a grudge won't change anything. What matters is that the truth came out, and that now I can rebuild my life." Margaret let out a relieved sigh, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You've always been an amazing woman, Sarah, and I should never have doubted that." The employees gathered around the two of them, celebrating the reconciliation with applause and smiles. Emily, who observed everything with her arms crossed, cracked a wide smile. "See, Mom, I knew everyone would see who you really are." Shortly after, Sarah and Emily returned home. For the first time in a long while, the small apartment felt cozier, safer. Emily lay down on the bed, already sleepy, and Sarah adjusted the covers over her, tenderly caressing her hair. "Now we can be together again without worries," she whispered, and Emily smiled before closing her eyes. Sarah lay down next to her daughter, feeling the comforting warmth of Emily's small body snuggling up against hers. For the first time in weeks, there was no hardness of a thin, uncomfortable mattress, nor the cold metallic sound of bars closing. Only the soft touch of clean sheets, the familiar scent of the room, and the tranquil rhythm of Emily's breathing filling the space with a silent, soothing melody. She slid her hand through her daughter's hair, feeling the softness of the strands between her fingers. Emily was already starting to close her eyes, but her little face still carried a slight smile as if, even while sleeping, she felt the relief of knowing that her mother was there, for real, to protect her. Sarah allowed herself to absorb every detail of that moment, etching it into her memory as a reminder that despite everything, she had prevailed. The clock on the wall showed almost midnight, and the open window let in the fresh evening breeze, gently swaying the curtains. Outside, the sounds of the city seemed distant, muffled by the comfort of home. No cold cell, no suspicious guard, no constant fear that something worse could happen. The only weight left on her shoulders was that of accumulated fatigue, but unlike the others, this one could be cured with rest. Closing her eyes, Sarah felt sleep come like a tranquil wave, carrying away all the worries that haunted her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't have to fight against fear before falling asleep. The past still existed, but now it was just a distant memory. The future, for the first time, seemed bright. In a few minutes, she fell into a deep sleep, allowing the scars of the past to finally begin to heal. The courtroom was packed again, but this time Sarah wasn't in the defendant's chair. She was sitting between Julie and Emily, watching attentively as the judge examined the final documents of the case. In the defendant's chair, Thomas kept his head down, his posture defeated. The man who once exuded arrogance and control now seemed fragile, crushed by the weight of the evidence against him. Next to him, the defense attorney no longer tried to convince him that there was any chance of overturning the verdict. The judge cleared his throat and began reading the sentence. After the presentation of evidence and the indirect confession of the defendant, this court declares Thomas McGregor guilty of fraud, grand theft, and tampering with evidence. Given the gravity of the crimes, the sentence will be 20 years in prison without the possibility of bail. There was a murmur among those present, followed by the sound of the gavel striking the desk. Thomas didn't move, didn't react. He merely closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if he already knew this would be the inevitable end. The prosecutor then stood up, picking up another document. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have a second arrest to report. Carlos Mendez, the cartel enforcer involved in the criminal scheme, has been apprehended and faces multiple charges, including extortion, receiving stolen goods, and making threats. Sarah felt a profound relief surge through her chest. Knowing that both of them were paying for what they had done gave her a sense of justice that seemed unattainable weeks ago. The judge turned to Thomas's lawyer and spoke formally. In light of the conviction and harm caused to the victim, this court also rules that the defendant is entitled to compensation for the damages suffered. Julie squeezed Sarah's hand discreetly, and Emily smiled upon hearing those words. Mrs. Sarah Carter, the judge continued, due to the wrongful imprisonment and moral and financial damages caused, this court orders Mr. Thomas McGregor to pay compensation to Mrs. Carter. The amount will be decided based on the diverted profits from the jewelry store and the illegally acquired assets. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that decision settle within her. The money wouldn't erase the sleepless nights, the constant fear or the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, but it meant something powerful: security. A fresh start, without the shadows of uncertainty that had accompanied her since the moment she was torn from her daughter. For the first time in months, she didn't have to worry about accumulated bills, Emily's stability, or the possibility of relying on the goodwill of others to survive. Now she could build a future with her own hands, without fear of tomorrow. Emily, seated beside her, held her hand tightly, her tiny thumb tracing slow circles over Sarah's skin, as if ensuring this was real. The girl didn't fully understand the weight of the compensation, but she sensed the change in her mother's posture, an almost imperceptible relief, but present. Now we can stay together without worries, right, Mum? She whispered, her eyes shining with hope. Sarah opened her eyes and smiled softly, squeezing her daughter's hand. Yes, my love. Now nothing will separate us again. As Thomas was escorted out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, Sarah watched without resentment. He was no longer a threat, merely a man destroyed by his own choices. She felt a shiver run through her skin, but it wasn't fear, it was liberation. Her life had finally returned to its axis. Justice had been served. Now she could breathe. Now she could start over. The days that followed Thomas's conviction brought Sarah something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Now that her life had stabilized, Emily was safe and her dignity had been restored. She felt she couldn't simply move on and forget everything she had gone through. For weeks, as she tried to resume her routine at the jewelry store, she couldn't ignore the idea of how many other people might be living the same nightmare she had faced. People unjustly imprisoned, voiceless, unsupported, victims of a system that didn't always care to find the truth. It was during a coffee with Julie that the decision finally took shape. I can't let this go, Julie, Sarah said, holding the cup between her hands. If I managed to get out of this, it was because I had you and Emily by my side. But what about those who have no one to fight for them? Julie smiled, leaning back in her chair. I knew you were going to say something like that. You've always been someone who cares about others, Sarah, and I think this could be your chance to turn something horrible into something powerful. In the following days, Sarah began to get involved with support groups for people wrongfully accused. She attended meetings, spoke with lawyers and public defenders, listened to stories from those still fighting to prove their innocence. With each new account, she felt an even stronger certainty that she needed to do something. Her time in prison had taught her a lot, and she knew her experience could help those still trapped in similar injustices. Julie, on the other hand, found a new purpose for herself. After weeks of investigating on her own, collecting evidence, following suspects, and building a case more solid than many lawyers, she realized she had a natural talent for it. If I was able to unmask Thomas, maybe I can help other people too, she told Sarah as they walked through the park on a sunny morning. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. You practically did the police's job yourself, Julie. Maybe you've found your true calling. That's exactly what happened. Determined to make a difference, Julie dove headfirst into studying private investigations. She spent hours reading books on evidence-gathering techniques, behavior analysis, and legal law. She enrolled in online courses, attended seminars, and whenever possible, spoke with professionals in the field to better understand how she could operate more effectively. What started as a desperate need to prove Sarah's innocence became her true vocation. At first, they were just small cases, people who needed help finding answers that no one else seemed willing to look for. Suspicious husbands and wives, inheritance disputes, fraud in small businesses. Julie analyzed every detail, followed clues others ignored, drew conclusions that went unnoticed by less attentive eyes. And little by little, her reputation began to grow. Sarah watched this transformation with admiration. She had always known Julie had a keen instinct for seeing beyond the obvious, but now she saw her friend becoming a key player in the fight against injustice. You were born for this, she told her one quiet night as they drank coffee in Sarah's kitchen. If it weren't for you, I'd still be in prison. Now, you can do the same for other people. Julie smiled, but her expression was serious. And I will. I won't let anyone else go through what you went through, Sarah. The title of amateur investigator had almost become official, but for Julie, it didn't matter. What really made a difference was knowing that her experience and determination were changing lives. The traumatic experience that had nearly destroyed their lives was now being transformed into something much greater. No injustice would go unnoticed again. They would ensure that. 1 year later, Sarah and Emily's lives had been completely transformed. The painful past still existed in their memories, but not as an open wound, rather as a reminder of what they had overcome together. The jewelry store, now under Sarah's new management, was thriving more than ever. Old and new customers frequented the place, not only for the quality of the jewelry, but also for the respect and admiration for the woman who, against all odds, rebuilt her life without letting injustice destroy her. On that sunny afternoon, Sarah was arranging a display window when she felt two little arms wrap around her waist. "Mommy, is Julie here yet?" Emily asked excitedly. Sarah's smile immediately widened as she looked at her daughter, who in just a year seemed to have grown so much. Her gaze carried a genuine happiness, different from the sadness that had marked her in the past. "She must be arriving," Sarah replied, brushing a lock of hair from the girl's face. "Today is a special day, isn't it?" Emily nodded enthusiastically. "I've always wanted her to be my godmother, and now it's official." Minutes later, Julie entered the jewelry store smiling, carrying a silver-wrapped package in her hands. "I hope I'm not late for my first official mission as a godmother," she joked, winking at Emily. The girl ran to hug her, and Sarah watched the scene with a full heart. Julie had become more than a friend. She was part of the family. Without her, none of this would have been possible. As the sun gilded the city outside, Sarah looked at Emily and Julie and knew with absolute certainty that love had truly won. The past could not be erased, but the future, that was full of possibilities. And now, for the first time, Sarah knew she didn't need to fear what was to come. She was surrounded by love, strength, and hope. She was where she had always meant to be. The afternoon sun gently entered through the jewelry store's windows, reflecting off the polished display cases and creating little beams of light that danced around the environment. The golden glow mingled with the cozy warmth of the moment, as Sarah, Julie, and Emily remained hand in hand, absorbing the sense of fulfillment that had long seemed unattainable. The store, once the stage for one of the worst phases of Sarah's life, now became a symbol of overcoming. Emily, her eyes shining with joy, squeezed Sarah and Julie's hands even tighter, feeling secure in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. "Now we'll never be apart again, right?" Her voice was light, laden with the innocence of a child who finally saw her world restored. Sarah crouched down to Emily's height, studying every detail of her little face illuminated by relief and genuine happiness. She gently ran her fingers through her daughter's hair, as if she wanted to absorb that promise of eternal closeness. "Never again," she replied, her voice full of certainty. Julie smiled, observing the complicity between mother and daughter. She never doubted that this day would come, but seeing it realized was something that warmed her heart in an indescribable way. "And I'll be here to ensure that," she added, winking at Emily, who smiled even more. Sarah took a deep breath, letting her gaze wander around the environment. For the first time in a long while, there was no fear, insecurity, or uncertainty about the future. Only a new beginning, a rebuilt home, a life where love finally prevailed. Did you enjoy Sarah and Emily's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.